There's this narrative out there that the Gen Zs are not as tough as previous generations.
Is this generation too coddled with technology, and are they not feeling the sense of hardships in order to overcome things, in order to grow as individuals?
Gone are the days of grinding 9 to 5 with no chill time, at least for them. They're setting up boundaries between work and life.
There's a real push to just kind of disassociate yourselves from the current systems that are in place because they seem to be unraveling or falling apart right before our very eyes.
They want transparency, they want consistency, and there are issues that they deeply care about. And to understand that, I think, is the first step in being able to engage and connect with this generation that's going to be a force.
I am very much empowered by this generation and also have high hopes that this generation will carry us indeed into the future.
And we're rolling. All right. Nikos, I'm still on the road and
Yes,
you
you
are
are
back home. But you will be
That's
on
right.
the road soon.
That's right.
You're away
Tomorrow.
for 3 weeks.
Yep. Back in SF, plowing away on that seed round and celebrating my mom's birthday at the same time.
So today we're talking about Generation Z. So let's define the Gen Zs. So they refer to a demographic or a cohort born roughly between 97 and 2012. So Gen Z is basically that generation that follows the millennials and precedes Gen Alpha. So let's talk about this generation. And I think it's really important to talk about this generation because they're really driving a lot of culture as we speak. And, they've been plugged into the digital world since day one. And these guys are the first generation to grow up with unlimited access to the internet. And they're not just scrolling, they're creating. They're the guys who are blowing up TikTok, starting YouTube channels. They're also mobilizing movements from literally their bedrooms. And this generation is using digital platforms and influencing massive audiences in ways that we've never seen before. But there are a few narratives that pop up that are a knock to this generation. And that's what we want to explore today.
I think you set the stage right. I think we'll talk about kind of the bleed over into Gen Alpha because that's a whole other generation in itself. But I wanted to specifically talk about this generation because of the fact that I am with Dial In building a product that is just for them. And there are just so many positive things to say about this generation. The fact that the one thing I will say to start kick off is that they intend, the intention is very, very strong in doing something good for the world and giving to humanity in the way that they only could. Even though they feel like they may be kind of trudging around and figuring out who they are and all of those things and figuring out a sense of identity that in times may be a complex cultural discussion or can be convoluted in a lot of different things that are associated with just the struggles of growing up in general. And then I wanted to kind of tie that to another narrative thread that we had that's been ongoing, which is around social media, mental health, and some of the detrimental effects of technology consumption overall, because of the fact that you had said, this was the first generation that grew up with the internet and smartphones and social media as essentially a constant, and what the potential impacts of that are coming from this generation. So really just unfolding and kind of taking apart what the psyche of this generation is. And then hopefully we can land the plane on something really, really awesome. That's both a rally cry and a spur on for inspiration or motivation for this generation.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's talk about resilience. There's this narrative out there that the Gen Zs are not as tough as previous generations, that they're quick to bounce when things get tough, dipping out of a job after a few months because they're not vibing with the stress or the drama. So there's this famous story about a young employee who, after just 8 months on the job, rolls up and asks for a fat raise. And basically, what they say is that, look, I'm killing it, just like you know the previous generation that's working here. So where's my raise? Where's my bag? But here's the thing, though, right? So experience isn't just about how well you perform when the sun is shining. It's about how you handle the storms, right? You have to be able to stick it out when things are getting real. So there's this perception that Gen Zs affect our work lives, or they have this perception that, their work lives and their relationships are separate. So they really are driving this whole narrative of work life balance.
Yeah, most definitely. I feel like there's somewhat of a carryover, like we had mentioned, because we did explore working with and leading millennials in a previous episode,
Yes.
which I feel like it hit the strike zone in, just because a lot of us are managing millennials and want to lead them. And to your point, there's a kind of perspective that millennials don't have that sense of resilience, or you need to kind of talk to them in a particular way that's a lot more respectful than in previous generations, where I know a ton of bosses that were just, bleep this out, a-holes to me, and would kind of get off on purely degrading, people at work. I don't know if you've been in hostile environments like that, but I sure have. And those environments were not fun at all, but I kind of just thought it was just kind of par for the course, right? Like, yeah, kind of pick yourself up by the bootstraps and, don't look like you were affected by it. And it really felt like you were getting kicked in the teeth a lot. And that type of theme that's carried over through millennials feels like it's also bleeding over into Gen Z. Now, I do have some data on this, and we could definitely link it to the chat. But just with respect to an observation, and we don't even have to tie this to data, but do we live in a generation where everything is at our disposal, where you have these beautiful things, and quite literally, as Jokoi has said it recently, you have an application to fill out an application. You could quite literally light up Chat GPT and it'll show you how to fill out your job application, what to say during that interview, how to kill it. It'll teach you how to code, build a platform, launch a company. It'll basically lay out the entire instruction manual for you. And so that's kind of just the epitome of where we live and how we're living in an exponential age where everything is quite literally at our disposal. From Uber to Uber Eats to having things delivered directly to your doorstep via Amazon, the big question here is this generation too coddled with technology, and are they not feeling the sense of hardships in order to overcome things, as we've talked about before, in order to grow as individuals? So
Hmm.
punting that question back to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So my perspective on this is that I don't agree with the narrative that they're coddled. I hear the narrative all the time, but I am surrounded with Gen Zers that are very resilient, that are just as resilient as the generation that came before them. And I think it really comes down to parenting. I think when they're in an environment that shapes them and guides them and leads them in ways that and coaches them in ways that encourage them to be more resilient and guides them in how to respond in certain situations and think and showing them how to think, not what to think, but how to think and how the real world actually works. So a lot of this really is about, what's going on at home. How are they being led? How are they being parented, at the grassroots level? And that really shapes whether or not they have that level of resilience that we've seen from previous generations, that we've seen from our generation. That's my perspective on this.
Yeah, let me unpack something there because I feel like, and there are definitely layers to aspects of resilience, right? It's much different to face rejection in kind of a meaningful way relative to, let's say, getting fired or losing a loved one or breaking up with your significant other, or there are just varying degrees of how one either accepts or overcomes challenges relative to the challenges that are very specific to their lives. One millennial that had worked for me kind of confided in me personally because she kind of looked at me as like a big brother of sorts. And she was telling me about how in dating life is kind of tough because everybody is kind of at the behest of their devices, and she uses apps for the most part to meet people, and noticed that the guys that had stood out were the ones that would approach her and talk to her in the wild, so to speak, right? In the wild, like whether she's at Whole Foods shopping or when she's out with friends at a bar or something, doing something like out and about rather than like meeting somebody in an app. And she just said,
Mm.
this was and yeah, she was a Gen Zer, right on the cusp of being a Gen Z or a millennial. And she said, since we're constantly kind of the slave of our devices, it's so much easier to put yourself out there when you're sliding through somebody's DMs rather than kind of approaching them in the aisles at Whole Foods or approaching them on the street or just socializing with people in general. And so I had attributed my previous statement to kind of the use and the reliance of technology where we're kind of at the behest of our own comfort zones with these devices versus quite literally just putting yourself out there. And I feel like I'm going to follow this up with another story where I was at a founders slash investor Web3 event recently a few weeks ago, and there was a Gen Zer, really, really young kid, kind of awkward, still kind of like feeling his way. And kind of, you could tell that he was kind of hesitant in like meeting people and hadn't really built up the confidence yet. But by the end of the day, I saw that he was just hustling. He finally found his flow and he was kind of like getting in there and even challenging me, to kind of get out there myself. I'm like, I've had like
Beautiful.
40 conversations and I pitched dial in like numerous times. Some people are getting it, some people are not. And I was just like spent, but I was like, oh man, but this kid is still going. So I'm like, I'm going to keep going too. So
You were
it was kind of
inspired.
inspiring. Yeah. He inspired me because I was like, oh man, this kid is still going. I'm going to go too. It's like, and part of that was like ego, of course, because it's like, can I go toe to toe with this kid that's still kind of hustling? And of course, kind of the competitive nature in me was winning, so to speak. But great examples of that sense of resilience relative to, again, kind of the things that we're normally comfortable with versus stepping out of our comfort zone. And I do feel like technology plays a big role, and social media obviously still plays a big role in shaping that behavior.
Yeah, no doubt. There's no doubt. But at the same time, the direction that the shaping takes place or how it unfolds really starts at home.
Yep.
And I'm coming from this, or I'm coming at this from, from a parent's perspective. And I see that, when I model the behavior that is resilient, it's focused, it's grounded, I feel that that cascades out to my environment, to my kids, to people that I'm around that are, the Gen Zers that I'm surrounded with. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely this notion of, the digital device influencing and shaping how we think. But I believe what it really comes down to is, how is that Gen Z's mind being shaped at home, and how they are being parented. I know I keep saying this over and over again because to me that's really the first frontier and the final frontier is that relationship. I see it with my niece and nephew. They are on social media, they have a digital device, it's in their back pocket, but the way they've been shaped and the way they've been, coached and parented has really, you know, helped them understand how to think about the digital device and how it's a tool for them to be able to be more productive, to stay connected, but not the other way around where they're enslaved by it and it starts shaping their character and their personality.
Yeah, it sounds like technology has always been a double-edged sword from that perspective, and
Yeah, there's no doubt.
Gen Z is no stranger to how you can utilize it both ways. And things that we've talked about before, unless you are a parent that teaches this generation to be aware of, again, the disparity between what you're seeing on your feed, and what if that Gen Zer is seeing nothing but hustle culture, Gary V style, hey, unless you're on YouTube with 3.2 million subscribers and making six figures every single month, then like, what are you actually doing? Do you unplug from the matrix? Do you go back and get a job? Do you hustle and do something else? Right. But also utilizing social media and technology as a pure platform of self expression, which is why I think a lot of Gen Zers, they aspire to be content creators because of what they see, because of not just the pure external validation or some of the things that tend to be flouted as glamorous or luxurious, but they truly find some way to connect with an audience that has these same intrinsic desires, or again, the nature of wanting to do something better for the world, and then end up building a platform around it, like you had mentioned Greta Thunberg, and maybe you want to get into that story. So it is, part of it is that double-edged sword, but part of it is also a conveyance and self-expression for these intrinsic values and principles that this generation holds.
Yeah. What I'm starting to see trend now is that high level of awareness of the impact that social media and being, on digital devices constantly, the impact that that's having on mental health, the awareness of the Gen Zers and Generation Alpha is actually starting to really take center stage. Have you started? I don't know if you've seen this video that's been trending about this, you know, going back to the analog device. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
There's this whole push to go back
Mhm.
to, because of the impact that they're aware is having on their mental health. I think we've hit the bottom of the barrel in terms of the negative effects that this is having on mental health. And, this whole curation and Instagram feeds looking flawless and TikToks being on point. I think we've reached the end of the barrel. And I think there's this high level of awareness that's starting to really take shape.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we can connect this to values and priorities because of that backlash. There's some kind of intrinsic intelligence that's saying, yeah, all is not as it seems. And I shouldn't trust everything that I see on my feed. And that goes very similar to what we're talking about with kind of larger institutions and a mistrust for what's going on, whether you're placing kind of the blame on mainstream media or lack of trust in the people that are supposed to be representing your interests, like politicians. And maybe there's a whole slew of people that can't affiliate themselves with neither party for all of those reasons and want to go more moderate. And then there's like the more extreme view from other folks that are just like, no matter who you vote for, who you pick, you're still picking the puppet on the left or the puppet or the right. And there's still an undercurrent shadow government that's kind of controlling all of the masses for this exact reason. And that's that same kind of extractive kind of process and methodology that they want to opt out of, right? Why are you hearing from so many content creators this rush to unplug from the matrix or escape the matrix, as we've done so ourselves in a previous episode? There's kind of like
Yeah.
there's a real push to just kind of like disassociate yourselves from the current systems that are in place because they seem to be unraveling or falling apart right before our very eyes.
Yeah. There's definitely an awareness that behind the fire posts, there's a lot of stress and second guessing going on, without a doubt. I mean, this I was having this conversation with the Gen Zer earlier, as I was thinking about this episode, and you know, there's that awareness that what they're seeing is a display of the good life, but in reality, it's a different story, right? It's a curated image, which can really mess with your head and make you feel like you're not living up to what you see online or what other people are doing. And when the real world doesn't match the perfect feed, it's easy to feel like you're falling short, or
Mhm.
which then tends to lead to burnout or quitting or just feeling lost. So
Yeah. Let me before you move on to the next point, I think this is an important one because you had started to explore how the home sets up certain conditions for success of resilience, and I think that's very important, but it's also important to note other factors, other cultural factors such as where you go to school. Obviously we've touched on it numerous times in terms of like what media you're consuming, so no need to get into that even though that's a part of it. But what are you seeing in the UAE specifically on things like the cultural movement around wokeism? Obviously, there are really good intent. There's some good intents coming from this in terms of loving your neighbor and accepting everybody for who they are, no matter who they are or what their personal lives kind of define for themselves, things like that. But this real push in institutions that a majority of people are now starting to call out, especially in the U.S. Are you seeing that in the UAE, just in terms of that same kind of cultural push to assimilate people and indoctrinate people toward a specific perspective culturally?
not as much as you see it, obviously. You're
Yeah,
you're in ground zero. You're at the center of gravity of this whole movement. But the region is still continues to be far more conservative relative
yeah,
to the rest of the world, and it's talked about, but it's not something that's discussed openly. It's
yeah,
it's not in the media.
yeah.
It's
Sure.
definitely not in the media, and it's an American media that makes its way into our feeds, but it's not in the local media. And
Got it.
I am starting to hear stories of wokeism starting to take shape, or it's starting to ideas starting to spread. But these are outliers. We're
Sure.
to a certain extent we're in a very conservative bubble, I should say,
Yep.
or a bubble where
Yeah.
wokeism isn't as you know front and center as the rest of the world. And another thing that really plays a big part, other than the home, is sports. Right, sports is a great way to build resilience, and I see that in the current generation. If I had to, you know, be objective about the the Gen Zers that are more resilient relative to the ones that are not. I mean, this just goes back to even our generation, right? I mean, if you
Mhm.
played sports, you're just more resilient than
Mhm.
you're the version of you that had not been exposed to you know basketball or soccer or rugby or whatever it is that you played,
Yeah.
right? so
Yeah.
so sports, parenting, I mean, it really comes down to grassroots, right? The
Yeah.
environment is constantly shifting, but what happens at home is the controllable. We can't
Totally.
control what's going on outside, right? But what we can control is the inner game that then shapes how we think about the outer game.
Most definitely. The one thing that I'll say, and we don't have to get crazy controversial or political about it, but there is a restoration of another cultural shift that comes back to conservative family values, right? It's almost like the erosion of these family values, or rather the cultural shift at the cost of certain family values, especially when it comes to things like young kids in school and teachers kind of forcing them to pick their genders and things like that. right? Where parents are now kind of like drawing the line against that, or perhaps the loss of masculinity in the mainstream, which is why you have a reemergence of the Jordan Petersons of the world that are appealing to the younger generation of young males, those that identify as young males and have kind of felt lost in a society in which those values are no longer cherished like they used to be, or even so far as to like the Andrew Tates of the world that are also catering to this younger demographic of men because of the fact that they don't see anything in the media that they can relate to anymore. And so it's just interesting how these cultural shifts are happening. I feel like people are just kind of finding and fumbling their own way through growing up, like we very much did in school and in college. And we didn't have nearly the amount of disparity and distractions of media just kind of like just being poured upon us, right? So we didn't have that state of confusion. We just kind of like, stuck with our own peer group and kind of went with it, even though, yeah, we went through some fairly hard times ourselves, and we got our first taste of it when the internet first came out, and then it just became drinking from the fire hose. So yeah, it tends to be all over the map, but I do feel like people, for the most part, what I'd like to think is that people have good intent, and when the intent tends to get kind of like misconstrued, I think the younger generation, Gen Zers of the world, because of the fact that they value authenticity so much, that they have like a keener spidey sense when somebody isn't being real or there's kind of a facade going on. So I will call out this generation's very astute ability to see through a lot of those masks and to go right for the jugular because of the fact that they value authenticity so much as a generation.
Hey there. We're taking a quick break from the show to let you know that if you'd like to invite Dirain or Nikos to speak at your next event on topics ranging from emergence and the inner game to the future of AI, we've got you covered. Simply email us at info@emergencenowpod.com. Once again, that's info@emergencenowpod.com. Now, let's dive back to the show.
So we've been talking about one of the main narratives, right, around Gen Zers, which is the lack of resilience. And to your point about, the lack of authenticity, or the presence of authenticity, there's definitely the other end of that spectrum, right? One can make the argument that, this whole curation game that they have on lock, right? The Instagram feeds looking flawless, TikTok being on point, all the posts that basically are the best curated self, as you've talked about in the past, right? Can lead to a lot of stress and second guessing. And that's definitely something that, you know, is present. It's true. It is happening, right? There's no doubt about that. The curated image can mess with your head, and it it can make you feel like you're not living up to, the expectation of yourself for yourself, or the expectation of what people have of you. And so when the real world doesn't match the perfect feed, it's like I said, it's easy to feel like you're falling short. So there's
Oh
definitely
yeah.
the other side of, you know, the challenge of authenticity in a curated world. Yes, they demand authenticity. I completely agree with that, and we'll get into a couple of stories that really highlight that point. But there's definitely the other end of the spectrum. So, and this is the danger of generalizations, right? Because you're always going to have part of this generation that buck the trend, that are the opposite of what is being discussed as shortcomings of the generation, of Gen Zs. So this challenge of being authentic in a curated world is definitely something that is real, and it's something that we definitely need to look out for and be mindful of.
Yeah. I notice we also tend to apply these characterizations for a specific segment when also the big caveat, as we very well know, is that much older people can demonstrate the same characterizations
100%.
in terms of a lack of authenticity, or want the same kind of authenticity, or are completely fake on their feeds and are telling people a bunch of lies and kind of proliferating this demeanor that isn't true, or are suffering from mental health or depression or narcissism or device addiction, that and they could be 60 years old and proliferating those same things.
Yeah.
So nobody, there's always an exception. And we will never make broad sweeping statements across the board. These are just observations, but it's more about, the way I want to communicate it is, if you are a Gen Zer, this is what I'm saying to you, because please hit us up and tell us, tell me your psyche. What motivates you? Why do you want to change the world? What about it do you want to change, and how would you do it? So I'll pose it both as a question for motivation, and then also a rally cry, because I genuinely want to know, because I am very much empowered by this generation, and also have high hopes that this generation will carry us indeed into the future, which is why I'm building a product specifically for them, very well knowing that a lot of the technologies and the systems that are in place don't exist for them, which is why we're creating this tool, so that they could finally create a world of their own, act with their own volition, have their own personal sovereignty, act with their own agency, and basically be sovereign in this new era, in this new world.
Another narrative that that surrounds Gen Zers is the fact that they're redefining what it means to have a real job, air quotes, real. And gone are the days of grinding 9 to 5 with no chill time, at least for them, right? That's what I've observed. They're setting up boundaries, like hard boundaries between work and life. And sometimes that clashes with what the workplace expects. I don't know if you remember this TikTok video that went viral. The one with the tech worker who basically is spending, I think it was his day,
Yes.
hitting pottery classes and chilling with friends,
Yeah.
and
There's a
barely
bunch of
doing
those.
any
Like,
actual
yeah.
work. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
But
a
I remember
product
the
manager
first
at
one.
Meta, and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's the new vibe, right? Prioritizing
Yeah.
well-being over the old school grind. And I mean, you mentioned Gary V, and there's definitely the other side of it, right? But they're definitely flipping, the script. And that's why I think it ties to the first narrative, which is, can they really handle the heat when the pressure's on? Because the pressure will come on. Or are they are they really setting up themselves for a rude awakening when reality really hits? So
It's both. It's both, right? Because in
it's
one
always both.
sense, on one sense, I'm like, okay, the first reaction is like, yeah, you can't take the heat because you didn't grow up in a world like Darren and I did, where you're pushing 80 hours a week and you had people yelling at you and all
Yeah.
of those things. But another side of me is like, you guys are smart, because it took you and I a really long time to get to where we are, where we get to choose what our day looks like. And we get to choose kind of the optimal intersection of work life balance, because we only want to work on the stuff that keeps us in the pocket, keeps us dialed in, keeps us in flow. And so, I mean, look at what's happening with AI right now. I mean, are we going to live in a world of UBI, where you get to automate as many tasks as possible and spend as much of your time just leveraging what you can automate and get paid for it, and get paid pretty well for it? Or are you going to need to kind of be put through the fire? And are you going to have to be forged by that fire into something better? And the answer is, of course, always both. It's going to depend for every individual. If you're lucky, you don't have to experience the tumultuous chaos of it all. But I would also argue that that chaos shapes you. And we had discussed numerous times before that if you don't experience those hardships, that pain that you need to overcome, then growth is nearly impossible.
Let's talk about the pros and cons of this, saying no to weekend emails and clocking out at 5 p.m. sharp, right? And making self-care like it's a non-negotiable. Let's talk about the cons first, right? What are the cons of that approach?
The cons are, to me, for the collective, because I'm a little bit on Elon's side on this, in terms of people got to show up to work at the office because that's where the innovation happens. When you're grinding as a team, you get to the maximum output and you get to build the best in class company that is truly remarkable. When you essentially start being a little bit more free, and you start being, when you start coddling your employees, you start to lose a little bit of that edge, which is exactly what we started to see with Google. Right, they started to implement a lot more of these lax type of, I mean, they used to do 20% time, but the 20% time was based on Google innovation. Yeah, you get to work on something on your own time after hours, but Google still gets to own it. Yeah, great. That's kind of like a win-win. You get credit for it, so forth and so on. But now, like, can you build the same kind of company that is truly remarkable without putting in
Yeah.
the time, the effort, the thought, all of those things? Are you grinding like, are you in the flow, in the pocket, like a Navy SEAL team that is just like this very, very well oiled machine, completely synchronous with one another? Or are you kind of just like, fly by the seat of your pants? Like, do you get more done? Some people would argue it's not really about output or outcomes. Maybe it is just about flow and feeling in the pocket. So I would say the obvious cons are you don't get that same kind of output. You don't get the same kind of optimal function or efficiency in working for a very, very top-notch organization. You don't have the intensity to deal with problems, and things kind of fall through the cracks. So you lose that optimality as an enterprise.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for the grind. And, the hustle culture gets a bad rap, but let's not forget that putting in the extra effort can pay off big time. I remember the story when I was consulting, there was this weekend where I had to work close to 2.5 days straight. So I was up working for more than 48 hours. And guess what followed that that period? Within a month, I was promoted to be the youngest manager in the firm, in the history of the firm.
Yeah.
So to me, that shaped me in terms of, you know, grinding it out and how,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a payback to the grind. And so, for me, if you were to ask me, is it a pro or is it a con? Is it good or bad? I would say yes, the hustle culture has a bad rap. There's no doubt about it. But there's something to be said about facing those really challenging situations and projects, even if it's eating into me time, because that could mean missing out, or that could mean creating career defining opportunities.
Would you be the same person you are today if it wasn't for experiencing burnout multiple times in your career?
No,
Yep.
absolutely not.
Same.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
definitely career defining.
It's
It
a,
was
yeah,
character
it's a part of it.
defining. It wasn't even career defining.
Sure.
It was character defining,
Yeah.
because that level of that mindset can be deployed across all facets of life, right? In relationships, in how you look at health, in how you look at career, business, your environment, hobbies, how you parent. I think it's definitely character defining.
Sure. Yeah, we're making the case for resilience. So it's funny how we keep going back to resilience. So okay, what
Yeah.
are the pros you're asking
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
being
What are the
of
pros?
taking care of yourself first?
Yeah.
The upside is your hair won't turn gray as quickly as it has with ours. And you won't have as much stress. And yeah, you get to go to yoga class at 8 a.m. and not have the pregame meeting with your boss. Great. Congrats. You get to take advantage of the amenities, and you get to look out for yourself and your well-being, which is interesting because that's kind of what it feels like. The way that we've been describing kind of our routines, we've somehow found a way to do that anyway, right? Like, grind at something that we truly love, but still manage to spend 15 to 20 hours in the gym every week just because we love it so much. And without taking care of ourselves, we're not at our best, right? And I think a huge part and theme of this show is like, what does it take to be, 100% dialed in? What's Darren at a 10 out of 10? What's Nikos at an 11 out of 10, right? What does it take to be so in the pocket every single day, performing your best? All of those things play a role, but where you put your energy is kind of also what you get out of it, right? We have finite time, we have finite energy. There's finite time we could spend with our families and things like that. So obviously the pros are around optimal time management in a way that keeps you happy. And so maybe you can stay resilient longer for longer periods of time if you're not kind of grinding it out and spending, 48 hours over a weekend and then being burnt out for the next 3 days and it taking like a toll on you where you have to recover for like 10 days straight. Like, right. So it's a little bit more, I'd say, sustainable with this pace. Are you able to compete, in such a competitive market economy with like lots of different products and all of those things? I don't know, but you do get to look out for your mental health. That's an obvious pro.
But okay, let me ask you this. So the pros are, saying goodbye to burnout culture and saying hello to, a life where work doesn't consume every waking moment. And
Yep.
I mean, let's be real. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't bring your A game to anything, whether it's work or
Yep.
play, right? Okay. Knowing what you know today about burnout, and there's a lot more information in the last 5 years, 7 years. If you could go back, if you were to go back to that moment where you got burnt out, knowing what you know today, if you had that information back then, and let's say you still grinded as hard as you did back then, but you had the information of burnout and being able to self-care at the same time, would that have led to burnout?
This one's an interesting one for me because I learned after the fact of why I was burnt out, and people burn out for numerous reasons. Not the reasons why most people would think, which is you're working yourself to death. And then some entrepreneurs, they end up in the hospital and things like that. But they're so lost in what they're doing and consumed by what they're doing and they love it. That's very different from a burnout as a result of being incredibly exhausted working for somebody else. And that's why I burned out, is because it was
Mm,
pure mental exhaustion. I was getting some value out of what I was doing, but it's not what I was supposed to be doing. It wasn't aligned
yeah,
with my purpose, my passion. And so the
beautiful.
mental exhaustion took a 10x toll on me than it did on my body, because my body was in good shape, like perfect condition.
Yeah.
But the mental exhaustion, I was like, I'm finding it really, really tough to go to work in the morning and to put a smile on my face and be a team player and do all of those things when it's just not aligned with what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, and that's exactly why, you know, I had my burnout. Exactly the same reason. What I hear you saying
Yeah.
is that it wasn't that there was too much, it was the fact that there was too little.
Yeah.
By too little, I mean the purpose, the meaning, right? So people don't
Yes.
burn out, or at
Yeah.
least we didn't burn out because there was too much going on. I mean, physically we could handle
Yeah.
it, right? We
Oh,
had
absolutely.
that resilience, but there wasn't enough meaning, and that's what led to
Yeah.
burnout.
Totally.
Yeah. And so
And I think there was a,
if you I was going to say, if you're purpose driven, no matter how much you're working, it's not going to lead to burnout. I mean, there are exceptions, but it's not going to lead to burnout the way we experienced it, because there was this inner fire, there's this inspiration, this drive internally that is constantly driving you forward, and and helping you recover as well, because the body is a very efficient piece of technology which knows how to self-regulate and self-recover, in spite of how hard we push it. But when there's no meaning, and when you know that you're grinding, and you're doing all these things, and you're putting in the hours, the blood, the sweat, you know that if it's not internally driven, if there's you don't have a deeper purpose, that leads to burnout.
Yeah, most definitely. And I kind of want to land the plane back to the Gen Z lens because this one is very critical because it is about finding your purpose. Again, another echo from our previous episode, right? The other piece to this, if you are getting started with your career, a lot of Gen Zers just may not know what they want to do. And if you do, kudos to you, right? If you know your craft, you know your vocation, put in the work, you'll end up being the best of the best at what you're doing because not only do you love it, but you've become decisive as to what that is, whether that's a content creator, solopreneur, whatever that is, right? If you're still trying to just figure things out, give yourself a little bit more leeway, right? Because that's not as definitive as saying, I want to go be an architect. I want to go be a concert pianist or something like that. It's much harder when you're kind of going from job to job and you're, part of that job is figuring things out. Another big part of burnout and burnout culture and hustle culture is hustling hustling a lot without a lot of wins, right? And so I've also experienced uh, burnout in kind of my early startup career when things just weren't going great. I mean, there's the momentum that you get when you're winning. I know what it's like to be part of a winning team and crushing it, and then kind of having a meteoric rise, from the perspective of a Silicon Valley unicorn. I've experienced that, but I've also experienced headache after headache of being in the trenches and not gaining any traction. And that'll burn you out sooner than later because it's like, well, why are we doing this if we're not getting a single win? Right. So that tends to burn you out a lot quicker. And then for the Gen Zers, that's kind of looking at it, from that lens. It's like, is this worth it? Because if you're a founder, that's a much different story. If you're a founder, this is my passion. Like I'll go to, into debt for something like this. I'll sacrifice a lot. I'll sacrifice having a relationship. I'll put off having, a family, and that becomes very purpose driven. But if you're in a startup and you're following somebody that is kind of like fitzing around, they don't know what
Yeah.
they're doing, and you're banging your head on the wall, like, is that worth it? Of course not. Definitely not worth it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you kind of got to pick and choose.
And I think one of the main themes of our show is really about self-awareness, and that's really the sweet spot, right? We spoke about the pros, we spoke about the cons, but if you're a leader listening to this show, it's really all about knowing what drives, what motivates, what inspires every member of your team, and being able to inspire and motivate each individual in the way that inspires them. That's what it's really about. It's like finding that personal sweet spot for that individual, because you can't apply the same playbook to every member of your team unless you're very clear on who becomes a member of your team. We talk about Elon all the time, right? I mean, he's bringing people on who are willing to be singularly focused on the mission. He's like the poster child of the anti work life balance, right? And
Absolutely.
if that's the
Yeah.
kind of team that you've built, then that's great, because then there's that level of self-awareness. But if it's not, and you expect everyone to perform at the same level and make the same sacrifices, then you're going to have a problem. So yes, I mean, that's what it really comes down to, is just being really self-aware of what drives and motivates you, because the hustle culture is not for everyone. I don't even like that word, hustle culture. I think, to me, it's all about resilience, and we've spoken about this, because there are times when that's what's required. That's what is needed. And
Yeah.
and there are times when you're able to take your foot off the gas, right? So it's really finding that, for lack of a better word, balance. So
I love this discussion. I feel like we've been, talking about, for the most part, both the pros and the cons, but then, talking about some of the detrimental things that can be said about the culture of this generation. But I do feel like we should land the plane on the positive aspects, particularly the ones that inspired me. And I was telling you about the story of the young founder that even motivated me. And I'm sensing this just very strong culture of wanting to do good for the world and humanity, and focusing those energies on truly making an impact. And all of those things are just very prototypical of what we talk about in this show, which is what is your mission to put a dent in the universe and make your mark and to do something and to be legendary and to do all of those things as an entrepreneur, as a founder, even as a young employee, and in your journey in life. And so I kind of want to open it up and get your thoughts on, do you feel like this generation is in the best place to do something good for the world, and how should they be focusing their energies or their time into a lot of these purpose driven or mission driven aspects of how they kind of cultivate their day-to-day lives?
Okay, can I answer that question with a story?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so picture this. It's 2018, and there's this 15-year-old girl from Sweden who's just completely done. She's finished with all the talk and no action on climate change. So her name is Greta Thunberg. And instead of just ranting online like most people do, she grabs a sign and she skips school and sits outside the Swedish parliament. And she's just chilling there with a sign that says, "School strike for climate." Now, what happens next? The whole world takes notice. Her solo protest sparks this global movement called Fridays for Future. So millions of students worldwide start skipping school. And, you know, not to slack off, but to demand that the world leaders, people who are really driving this change or holding back this change, to stop messing around and start saving the planet. So she even, you know, she even roasted some world leaders at the UN with her iconic "How dare you" speech, and this basically completely went viral. So she quickly became the face of climate activism, and that's such a empowering story for Gen Z, or she's a Gen Z, where she didn't just sit back and watch the world burn. She literally took on the streets and took action. And she now has the entire planet listening. I mean, she's a household name. You've heard of her. We spoke about this before we started rolling today. She, to me, is the symbol of the empowering force behind Gen Z, this whole generation.
Yeah. What I like about her story is that it came from a place of intent and wanting to do good, because she was reading the data, she was reading all the scientific research, and she was sick, like you said, of sitting around and doing nothing and just complaining and doing a blog post or a video. She turned into an activist right away because she felt so deeply passionate about it. So
15.
That's a key thing. Yeah, 15 years old
15.
and finding your why. Like it. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
it took me forever to find my why. I feel like I'm still
Yeah.
trying to find my why. And so
Yeah.
it's just very inspiring to have that sense of purpose so early on. But once it clicks, though, the big lesson there is that once it clicks, like your whole life is going to be flipped upside down because you're asking for it. And when you ask for it, you'll 100% get it, because you're programming yourself, you're programming the universe, and the universe will hand it to you in really unexpected ways. And so she got it. And so when you ask for that why and you have that sense of purpose, and even if you don't know what you want to do yet, just creating the space for it to call out to the universe or God and just say, what am I here to do? Give me a sign, tell me what I'm supposed to do with my life. And just that symbol of creating that space will lead to something very, very magnificent. It'll lead to a door, and that door will open, and all you have to do is walk through it.
Well said. I've got a second story for you. So 3 years later, it's 2021. A bunch of hedge fund dudes are betting against this company called GameStop. It's that old school video game store that you had in every corner of every city in the United States. And so they think that the stock is going to tank, right? That's the bet they made. the hedge fund dudes. But then, you had these regular folks, mostly Gen Zs and millennials, decide to flip the script. So they band together on this platform called Reddit, and the subreddit was called Wall Street Bets, and they start buying GameStop stock like crazy, and they're all hyped up, throwing up memes and using phrases like "hold the line" and diamond hands. And guess what happens? The price of the stock skyrockets, and it leaves the hedge fund guys losing billions, not millions, but billions of dollars, while these Reddit warriors, they do really well. So it's basically, the underdogs versus the financial elite, right? Main Street versus Wall Street. And Main Street won. And this wasn't just about, and the beauty about this story is it wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about that. It was about sending a message. And what really shines through for me is that the Gen Zers are not afraid to shake things up. They're willing to really get behind the cause and band together. I mean, the way this was orchestrated was, a case study in itself. So those are two of my favorite Gen Z stories.
Yeah. What I love about that GameStop story is that it was a clear message to the institutional elites and an intrinsic desire to unplug from that. And hey, it's a true Robin Hood type win, right? Which is kind of ironic because we know what happened with Robin Hood, the platform too. Yeah. And they got in trouble because they stopped allowing the Gen Zers to buy more of that stock. So that was actually very, very controversial to Robinhood when they should have been on the side of these guys. But no, the institutional investors that were on those boards were putting pressure on them. So it made the Gen Zers double down on GameStop. And so I love this narrative because it's everything that we talk about at Dial In is like, get rid of the old, too much is going on with centralized powers that be. Money is one. It's like, why can't you give Main Street a little bit more? You guys can quite literally print more money and just give it to the little guy, right? The little guys need a win. And so I love everything about unplugging from the matrix, kind of sticking it back to the man. All of those stories are very much inspiring because that's very much the world that we live in right now. So I love everything about both of those stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that pretty much says it right there. I think that, if we reflect on the importance of understanding and supporting this next generation, I feel like they have the whole world at the palm of their hands. And I feel very confident that it's a generation that can quite literally take us into the future because, the future does belong to those who embrace change, challenge the status quo, and create these new pathways. And I truly believe that Gen Z is already walking that path. And, I feel like we should walk with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're a leader or business listening to the show, Gen Zers want to see real action. And they want transparency. They want consistency, and there are issues that they deeply care about. And to understand that, I think is the first step in really staying relevant and being able to sell and engage and connect with this generation that's going to be a force. They're already a force. All right. Thank you for listening to the show. We hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, we would love for you to rate and review the show. It really helps nudge the algorithms that determine the fate of podcast discoverability. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Emergence Now, where we explore the emerging trends, technologies, and ideas that are shaping our world today for you to discover yourself. We hope you enjoyed this episode and gained valuable insights that you can apply in your own life. If you want to stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we share additional content, engage with our community, and keep the conversation going. Thanks again for listening to Emergence Now, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode.